Okay, today Michelangelo and St. Peter's. Well, hopefully in a couple of weeks we'll go together as a class to the Met in two sessions to explore what's being offered there and try to see it in the light of what we've been reading and what I've been sketching in these talks. Buildings are harder to transport. So we're going to be transported through drawings and photographs and other images back into the 16th century, into the big conundrum, which is Michelangelo's, which is St. Peter's, period, as well as Michelangelo's St. Peter's. So, yes. So, initiating, untangling, and transforming. But before we get to St. Peter's, and I'm showing an image of what St. Peter's looked like towards the end of the 16th century, after Michelangelo's contributions and those of his heirs who more or less continued much of what he started. Okay, I didn't know this, but there's a lovely, careful, accurate casting of the Pietà in Salt Lake City. It would have been nice. I spent 5 months in Salt Lake City. Okay. Anyhow, what I liked about this photograph was it, I believe, is taken at the correct eye level for most people vis-a-vis the statue. And this is a footnote, but I didn't have these photographs when I gave you my last talk. If you look at the statue dead on from the top, as this photograph shows, you realize that to a certain extent, the three-dimensionality is partially illusionary, that it is like a very robust high relief tending towards a fully three-dimensional freestanding statue. But more striking is this image. You see the unfinished parts here, roughly chiseled. What this clearly indicates is that the statue stood in a was placed in a semicircular niche where only a part of it was projecting out of the niche, which would mean that the background was in shadow. You would see it in contrast. It was, in fact, operating very much as a very robust, extremely high relief rather than a freestanding image like we imagine it. Okay, the other great work. There are a few things that I should have said but didn't last time, but what I wanted to point out was the point of view of the images. Who is the privileged viewer? And when you look up at it, the privileged viewer is the Pope. It's not painted from the perspective of the congregation. It's painted from the perspective of the Pope looking out. Its point of coherence is looking back from the altar. Well, because all the scenes are meant to be seen from the altar looking towards the entry. They're backward if you look up, looking towards the altar. Yes, the privileged viewer is the Pope. Of course it's the Pope. Why would we be surprised? Okay, this was not a democracy. Okay, furthermore, there is this wonderful sketch which Michelangelo left us showing him painting the ceiling. So any notions of him laying on his back, first of all, are physiologically impossible. But no, of course he stood, stretched, and had paint dripping into his eyes and face at times, undoubtedly. Okay, and this is just to say I haven't even touched on that aspect of him. Michelangelo was a poet and wrote a great number of sonnets, and the sonnets are, in many ways, other than the works of art, as works of art, the principal evidence for him as an artist, what he had in mind, and him as a human being. And there are several weighty books which have been written on that subject. Okay, So once he painted the ceiling, Michelangelo became a part of the patrimony of Rome. And here is a wonderful sketch by one of the Zuccari brothers. Actually, it's the younger showing the elder studying the Last Judgment. Do you see the Last Judgment in the background? Okay. However, Michelangelo, by the later 16th century, was in many ways, although standing out as a giant among some rather tall figures, to be sure, it really wasn't Michelangelo who dominated the end of the 16th century. It was, in fact, Raphael, his probably best student. And so you have our friend, Mr. Zuccari, also carefully studying the loggia with the Cupid and Psyche fresco cycle that was being completed when Raphael died, and that was in fact finished by his foremost student, Giulio Romano, in his Atelier sometime in the early 1520s. Okay, because the most paradigmatic painting of the 16th century is none of the above, but it is in fact this painting by Raphael, the Triumph of Galatea, which will become the paradigmatic painting of the whole academic school. And I talked about it last year. So just putting Michelangelo in a bit of a context, but there is a profound commonality between these two paintings. Just look at the background. Look at the relationship of the figures to the forward picture plane. Look at how they're fundamentally compositions of figures. But remember, the Galatea precedes the Last Judgment by 2 decades. So the fact that Michelangelo somehow was always on the forefront and wasn't learning from the people breathing down his neck around him, the other giants that were his contemporaries, is clearly not the case and should always be put in context. Okay, and of course, then there's the rest of antiquity. Michelangelo certainly drew people's attention to works of antiquity that they were already fascinated by. And this is, again, Mr. Zuccari. Taddeo is the person being painted or illustrated here, is focusing on the Laocoon. But this is the statue which will dominate the 17th and 18th century, the Apollo Belvedere. Okay, so even 2 or 3 decades after Michelangelo died, St. Peter's was still a mishmash where the whole forward third, being the surviving medieval and fragments of the late antique basilica, still standing essentially until the first decades of the 17th century. So once again, I show you this image and the next one to remind you the Rome of Michelangelo was medieval Rome. And he is very much a product of the late Middle Ages. We look back at him, and in our art history and periodization, he's comfortably put into the High Renaissance. But remember who his favorite author was. It was not Petrarch, but Dante. Okay, another illustration of late medieval Rome in the early 16th century, and this is from the new technology of book printing and illustrating the printing. So, the forward part of St. Peter's still looked like this when Michelangelo was given the task of finishing it, or even before when he first arrived in Rome. I'm going to show you the courtyard from a surviving 16th century drawing. And in the other direction, there was a great mosaic. It was the newest contribution to St. Peter's other than the bronze doors. And this was a huge mosaic by none other than Giotto. We know it, sadly, only from two drawings. This line drawing, which preserves a lot of the composition and something of the characterization of the figures, and this slightly later painting. So this was obliterated in the early 17th century, and sadly, not much more. Actually, I think a few faces survive of the mosaic, and that's pretty much it. Pardon? Oh, it's St. Peter wanting to follow Christ on the water, walking on the waters of Galilee, and the mosaic of Giotto. Oh, I can't look at my notes because I don't have my other computer with me. But if you go into the PowerPoint, each one of these images is footnoted. But it's a late 16th century. Yeah, it's a copy of what was there in mosaic. And looking back in the other direction, this is what St. Peter's looked like when Michelangelo died. The drum had been started, the dome hadn't been started. 1/3 of the Constantinian Basilica still survived, much of the atrium, and right in the middle was this remarkable fountain house with this remarkable gigantic bronze object and a couple of bronze peacocks. And dolphins, etc., gracing it. So this is that same bronze object today. It's the culminating feature of the Belvedere Court. Many of you who've been there all of you who've been there have seen it. So I'm just going to quickly go and sketch out the Belvedere project. And Michelangelo's contribution was the second story and the larger, tighter exedra and the stairs and putting the pine cone there. The semidome, perhaps, but the whole thing was actually finished by Piero Ligorio after Michelangelo died. Here are two sketches which are contemporary with the initial Bramante project. Okay, what is the significance? The significance is that when Pope Julius became Pope, he began first thinking about his tomb and then about expanding the Vatican Palace. The church came afterwards. So Bramante was first brought on as the architect of connecting the Belvedere, which his predecessor Nicholas V had started, and the expanding Vatican Palace, which was intended to become the new center of Christendom, replacing the palace at St. John Lateran on the other side of the city, as I showed you last time. So this is what the Upper Belvedere Court looked like when Bramante's contribution was more or less complete. There you see the mid-15th century Belvedere, where you have the beautiful view, and the culminating court. And this is Bramante's vision, the 15th century structure with its crenellation poking up, and these two huge courtyards joined by this intermediate set of terraces. So there's just a sketch showing the preceding parts and the new parts. And here's a close-up section of the same. And here is our one contemporary witness, a fragment of a fresco that used to be in the Castello Sant'Angelo, and which now resides transferred onto canvas. I'm not sure actually where, maybe in the Vatican. Okay, so it's a bit of a conceit, because in the lower courtyard you see a naval battle, right? It's a naumachia. It never happened. It is what it's really showing is that what Bramante was trying to create is a framed, gigantic, ancient garden, bringing the Belvedere, pulling it into the architectural ensemble of the late medieval, early Renaissance palace. And one of the ancient sites that was in the vicinity of the Vatican was a naumachia, a giant place for naval battles that had been built by Augustus and whose exact site was vanished. And so this is the speculation of the painter that maybe the site was the Belvedere. In other words, the Belvedere is in part an imaginative recreation of a lost Roman monument that was supposed to be somewhere in the vicinity as a gigantic garden. Okay, so the privileged point of view, remember privileged point of views? It's the Pope's apartments, of course. And that's the vanishing point and horizon point for the whole composition. Here's a drawing which shows us from top to bottom. Each level has its own particular compositional structure, but ultimately the privileged view, of course, is the Pope's. There's just a close-up of the upper part with the single story as Bramante envisioned it, a close-up of the exedra with the theatral stairs, and then the lower court. And so the revolutionary moment here is this is the first time that the three orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, are shown superposed one above the other in a work of architecture, both in the lower courtyard of Bramante's Belvedere. Here's another contemporary sketch of the lower courtyard. There you see them together. And what happened in the lower courtyard? Well, things like jousts to celebrate important aristocratic marriages between important members of the papal court. It was a pretty good stage for that. And in the background, you see this joust, which is contemporary with Michelangelo in his 80s, with the dome's drum under construction, and one of the other exedra, which was under construction. And here's the view, a bird's eye view showing, and this is not hair sprouting, but fireworks sprouting out of the top of the upper Belvedere exedra. And there you see another sort of joust, another event going on there. Okay, so we do have one great surviving 16th century work, which is a recreation of an ancient garden by Michelangelo's collaborator, who actually took over from Michelangelo after he died at St. Peter's, Piero Ligorio, and this is his a colored engraving of the Villa d'Este as it was the whole of the conception. It was only partially realized at Tivoli. And of course, prototypes, always Roman. So, yes, and the other part of the palace, of course, is the great spiral stair, which really isn't meant for pedestrians, but it was designed so that you could, on horseback, go from the lowest part to the upper part, and then arrive on the upper Belvedere court. No, but what's important is that, again, you go from Tuscan to Doric to Ionic to Corinthian to composite. So it's the first time all the five orders are present in a systematic work of architecture, and that's where it is, as a part of the Belvedere Court. These are drawings of the Vatican Palace as they essentially stand today, drawn in the mid-19th century. So we'll zoom through this. Okay, now, Julius II wasn't just building a gigantic palace for himself, like an ancient villa, and initiating the rebuilding of St. Peter's, but was also transforming Rome. And his big project, which still survives today, Julius's best preserved project, is the Via Julia, the great straight road that cut through a part of the medieval fabric. And on the other side, the parallel road, I forget the name of it, in the Trastevere side. of the city. He began a huge law courts. Again, Bramante was the architect at this spot, but only fragments of the foundations and basement story survive today. Okay, so St. Peter's. So what is the big thing about St. Peter's? St. Peter is said to have been buried there after being martyred, right? Okay, this is a myth. This is a pious myth. St. Peter's was constructed on the site of a memorial to St. Peter's by Constantine. And here's an overlay of Constantine's St. Peter's over the current footprint of Michelangelo's St. Peter's. The memorial was in a cemetery which had developed on one side of the then abandoned, sometime in the 2nd century, hippodrome of Gaius and Nero. And in the back, between some of these pagan tombs, was a little courtyard with a red wall with a niche that was the memorial. Now, how can I say with such confidence that this isn't St. Peter's tomb, even though all your textbooks are going to say that it... Yes, his body was brought there. It was brought there by Constantine. The memorial was not the site of his tomb. St. Peter, when he was martyred, along with St. Paul, were both buried in the Jewish catacombs on the Via Appia, on the site of the later Basilica Apostolorum, which is today known as the Basilica of St. Sebastian. Their bodies were then transferred to the two great basilicas built in their honor only in the 4th century AD. Okay, what is the evidence? It is actually in the graffiti that survive archaeologically in this site and at the Basilica Apostolorum. At the Basilica Apostolorum, you have graffiti from the 2nd and 3rd centuries preceding Constantine, clearly indicating that whoever scratched the graffiti, essentially it's Peter and Paul, please pray for us, are doing this because they're at the site of the relics. Okay, such graffiti does not exist on this site until after Constantine. In other words, just prior to the beginning of the building of this basilica, does this site suddenly attain this preeminence? Okay, not a big deal. I mean, it is a big deal if you're a Catholic and you want to believe that Peter was buried there from time immemorial. But Constantine preserved the remnants of this very, very humble memorial at the point of the later high altar. And you see the remains of the Roman cemetery here. And at floor level, that red wall and the niche was embedded in this elaborate bronze and marble, essentially cube, over which Constantine then built a very elaborate baldacchino and became the focus of the basilica. The basilica under Constantine and basically into the High Middle Ages was a commemorative place where people were buried. It wasn't a liturgical basilica. The Pope's primary basilica was the Lateran. It's only post-Renaissance that it became the focus of the Catholic Church. Okay, here's a good digital reconstruction of the Constantinian Basilica. It was very elaborate. It had a polychrome nave made of many different colored marbles. Here are just some surviving ones based on Baldassare Peruzzi, who was literally Bramante's right-hand man, because he drew for him. Bramante, when he started working on St. Peter's, was suffering from extreme arthritis of the hands and couldn't draw. He cataloged all the surviving columns which had survived Bramante's first onslaught, and the forward third of the basilica was then walled off and continued to operate as the church while the rest of it was under construction, which is why we know a lot about the high altar, because, believe it or not, this painting, probably by Giulio Romano, following Raphael's designs, of the coronation of the donation of Constantine. Rather, there you see it in the Constantine room in the Vatican. Here, right? Anyhow, this high altar survived into the late 16th century because, and here's one of the columns of the so-called Solomonic order, which then they also survive. They're right up here as relics, and then you have Bernini's gigantic reconstitution of them. Anyways, they were put in a little building which Bramante built that preserved the Constantinian apse and Constantinian and later medieval high altar. I'm just showing you from a couple of drawings from the Renaissance. And the pink are the remains of the Constantinian Basilica while the Great Crossing was being built. There's a plan of it. The facade, so this is a Bramante elevation, another sketch of it. Okay, giant crossing. They began a big project. Now, the story I told you last time or the time before about how Michelangelo initiated St. Peter's comes directly from Michelangelo, and this is from Condivi's Life of Michelangelo, published in the decade before Michelangelo died, so probably written when Michelangelo was in his 60s, saying, having seen his design of the tomb, the Pope sent Michelangelo to St. Peter's to decide where it might most conveniently be erected. And we're talking about the first design, the wall tomb. The church was in the form of a cross. At the head, Pope Nicholas V had begun to rebuild the tribune. The walls were already 3 braccia, sort of roughly 3 feet above the ground when he died. It seemed to actually more like 6 feet above the ground, yeah. It seemed to Michelangelo that this place was very suitable, i.e. the place behind the high altar. When he returned to the Pope, he told him what he thought and added that if it seemed good to His Holiness, it would be necessary to go on with the building and roof it in. The Pope asked him what would be the cost of this. Michelangelo replied, 100,000 scudi. Let it be 200,000, said Julius. In other words, make it even more magnificent. So that's the hint there. And sending Sangallo, the architect, and Bramante to see the place, by their suggestions, it came into the mind of the Pope to rebuild the church altogether. So, in that story, in some sense, Michelangelo initiates the project, the new project for St. Peter's. Okay, now, the whole story of the rebuilding of St. Peter's is still a morass of contradictory stories in the literature, incomplete evidence. And so I'm just going to give you a sketch of what seems to make the most sense based on my readings. Okay, so it is very probable that really what began as a continuation of the crossing and a new choir for St. Peter's under Nicholas V, in the process became a bigger and bigger project, which eventually resulted in the project that we know. So you've seen this before, the Constantinian Basilica, the Nicholas V extension, and the overlay is actually a drawing of not Bramante's first but second project. Here you see Bramante's first project overlaid on it, the so-called parchment plan, which is very probable, that was actually the first, or actually the second conception. This is a model reconstruction of what Nicholas V and his mid-15th century architects probably had in mind. There's actually a coin or a medal which commemorates the continuation of the project sometime in the 1480s. And somebody at some point extended the project, so this is the actual project on this side, into a gigantic rebuilding of St. Peter's in a very let's just say, less than glorious 15th century manner. And this is a person's hypothetical sketch of that. A little bit too many repetitions of a module. Okay, so back to Michelangelo. So quite possibly he did suggest a wall tomb right here. And, okay, well, there's St. Peter's again. There was a pyramid in the Borgo. There's a drawing of the site of the pyramid. There you see the pyramid in the model of Rome as it looked like at the time of Constantine. And remember, the story is that St. Peter was crucified, and the medievals and the Renaissance people read the passage as saying, and it's a later, it's not a direct witness, but it's a part of the tradition of St. Peter's martyrdom, between the two meta. And in the Middle Ages, they thought that meta meant pyramids, and there are two pyramids. There were in Rome, one right here, and the other right over here. And this is from the 18th century plan. And that's why the previous pope, the Borgia Pope, built the Tempietto here, more or less halfway between the two pyramids. But of course, this is nonsense, because the meta are in fact the triple columns at the end of the spina. This is a reconstruction of the Hippodrome of Gaius and Nero. And if Peter was crucified between the meta, he would have been crucified in the Hippodrome, basically at the site of the obelisk. And why do I say the obelisk? Actually, this reconstruction has the Hippodrome backward. Recent excavations had discovered that the circular part was on this end. It follows the Circus Maximus, and the imperial box in the Circus Maximus and in standard hippodromes was basically across from the center where the obelisk was. On the other side was a temple to the sun, and that was the finishing line. So if you want to know where Peter was probably crucified, somewhere about here. So, and as you know, the obelisk has been moved, so there is nothing to commemorate the site of Peter's crucifixion on the vicissitudes of history and the charming misreadings and other things that human beings do over time. Okay, back to Michelangelo. This is a better image of that first project than I showed you last time because there's more contrast. You actually see more. Based on a type that is directly related to Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Michelozzo's tomb of, okay. So the new idea, of course, was to turn it into a early 15th century mausoleum of Halicarnassus. One of the Sangallos, a contemporary of Michelangelo's, was reading Pliny the Elder and reconstructed the tomb like this. Michelangelo envisioned the tomb more or less like this. This is a later, I think this is version 3 of the tomb. Here's somebody's three-dimensional reconstruction of it. You can see how it would have completely dominated the whole church if it had been built. More than 40 statues, not including 40 marble statues, not including the bronzes, etc. Okay, so what they started was, well, something that was way too big and actually unbuildable. What do I mean by that? See these piers? Too small. If you're going to put, as it is said, the dome of St. Mary of the Martyrs, which is the Pantheon, on top of the Basilica of the Temple of Peace, which is the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine, you're going to need very strong walls. So Bramante's first project was unrealizable, which is why we eventually ended up with Bramante's final project and the different iterations of that. So that's Bramante's first project. You'll see why I'm returning to it when we get to Michelangelo. Here is the first project in relation to the second tomb, not the tall pyramid, not the tall tower tomb, but the little building tomb, which was still huge. And we really only know this from verbal descriptions. There are no sketches of it. Here is a perspectival sketch of what the interior of Bramante's original conception more or less would have looked like. There's the metal that was cast for it. There's a 20th century reconstruction of it volumetrically, and that's what they actually began to build in the later, around 1510 or so. So there's Peruzzi's sketch of what they were starting to build as a three-dimensional cutaway perspective, a more contrasty image of it. And here's Peruzzi's drawing of the big project when Bramante died. Look at all the little columns. What are all the little columns doing there? They're an example of extreme bad conscience manifest in architecture. In other words, a lot of people, and in the popes back and forth as well, thought this is an act of sacrilege. We're destroying a building which is 1,200 years old, which is the original building which Constantine started on this site, which has had the tombs of 1,000 years of popes, almost 900 years of popes, which is full of history and all the pieties that go along with it. And we're obliterating it, which is literally what they were doing. They were obliterating it. So the bad conscience is, well, maybe we should just keep all the columns. So this is what you're seeing there, all the ancient columns being preserved. You don't see it in these perspectives. In the second project, that was the one actually being constructed of Bramante's, essentially Peruzzi's, the giant order was first introduced, rather than 2 stories, 1 story. And here's a worm's eye view of the second project, which is actually what was being built. A look at this tomb was probably intended still originally for behind the high altar, and then moved into one of the rotundas on the either side of the altar. There's a reconstruction of it. Again, a lot of it is necessarily hypothetical, other than what we have is the sketch and some writings, but it would have been a big building. And there you see, this is not at the high altar, but in one of the subsidiary rotundas, where it eventually ended up before it was abandoned. Okay, so when the anecdote says the dome of, in our terms, the Pantheon on top of the Basilica of Maxentius Constantine, literally, they meant it literally, because the crossing is the diameter of the Pantheon. Same diameter. Actually, it's a little smaller. And the nave, the eventual nave, is the dimensions of the Basilica of Constantine Maxentius. Here we see it in a Piranesi drawing. Here we see it, the plan. But notice the difference. See how thin these walls are? See how thin the piers are? How could the Romans build something so gigantic with a lot less wall? Well, you should all know what the answer is. Opus cementicum, Roman cement. That material and the way of building that way was lost in the Middle Ages and was unknown to the Renaissance. So the Renaissance form of construction is essentially rubble, a rubble core around a ashlar masonry surround, and not as stable. And so a third of this building almost is still standing. This is what it looked like. More was standing in the Renaissance, and so the giant order, the dimensions of Bramante's project, is taken from the Basilica of Maxentius Constantine. Here's a digital view of it. Basically, if you want to know what it looked like, it's the nave of St. Peter's today in terms of scale. But much lighter and better lit because it had big windows, a lighter dome that basically ballooned up from the the columns, and we had a version of this in New York until the mid-1960s. That was the old Penn Station, which was obliterated, as you know. Now, Bramante was called in because he was building a huge cathedral for Pavia in northern Italy that was approaching the scale that Julius was envisaging, and this is what remains of the crossing of Pavia Cathedral, and here's a sketch of it. Again, a Renaissance transformation of a Gothic type with a large dome. Unfortunately, this is the model, the wooden model. No, not unfortunate that it's a model, but this sure doesn't look like a high Renaissance building, right? It looks like a Gothic building that has been fiddled with classical details. Okay. So in Peruzzi's hand, we actually have the Basilica of Maxentius being drawn to scale in relation to the crossing of the Pantheon, which then Peruzzi transforms into a possible project for St. Peter's, where you literally have the rotunda attached to the early 4th century Roman basilica. Many exploratory sketches survive. There's so many, and they're so hard to sort out, even in whose hands they are, that it's one of the reasons why there's so much confusion about how the project developed. This is also Peruzzi, a giant rotunda. This is more realistic with bigger piers. Again, the bad conscience, all the little columns. Another drawing by Peruzzi of the crossing. This is a volumetric sketch of the conception. Because, of course, if the Pantheon is a remarkable achievement at ground level, putting it up in the sky is going to be an even more remarkable engineering achievement. And then pattern making. Pattern making basically takes over. They're looking at patterns and trying to turn them into plans. This is also a sketch by Peruzzi, which results in a lot of these various gigantic projects. The built parts are the parts that are solid. So very quickly, Pope Julius was in a very big hurry, because as you know, he had wanted to be Pope at least 30 years earlier, and it didn't pan out. So he wasn't in the best of health and getting on in years. So he said, well, I don't have time for this. Why don't you build directly on the foundations of the choir of Nicholas V? So that's actually what Bramante first built. He didn't start building this project. He started building something that looked like this. Completely crazy, as you'll see when you look at the scale. This is a version somewhere along the lines, not of an architect, he got an architect to draw for him, but of a Vatican bureaucrat, suggesting his idea for the new St. Peter's. Our St. Peter's is that. And this is what it looks like three-dimensionally. Okay, their imagination was getting so far ahead in their ambitions, and yet they struggled to make sense of it and make it buildable, different versions of it. But as I said, this is what was actually realized, just the choir and the crossing of Bramante's. This is a sketch of Bramante's choir with that huge shell. And a smaller version, well, I'll show you in a second. Here's Michelangelo's tomb in relation to Bramante's choir with a huge shell. There are two other reconstructions of it. Bramante built a smaller version of it as the choir behind the high altar in Santa Maria del Popolo. There's a plan of it. And that's what it looks like today. So a miniature version of what Bramante was actually building, right behind the preserved high altar in his other little building. Okay, so a huge building site that eventually results in the Pink Project. Um, Let me just get there. Okay, the crossing. What is the Pink Project? The Pink Project, well, here's the trajectory. So we have Bramante's first project. We have various attempts to make it realizable. We have Raphael's version of Bramante's project, Peruzzi's, and then finally Antonio Sangallo becomes the architect, and then we'll get to Michelangelo. Okay, this wasn't the only scale, fantastic scale. It was to put it in a giant enclosure that was larger than that of the Baths of Diocletian or Caracalla. So this is the Peruzzi project with the huge enclosure, which would have been the Vatican Palace surrounding St. Peter's, which would have meant demolishing, of course, the Sistine Chapel and everything else. Okay, so there you see the project that was underway when Julius died, and there is a sketch of it three-dimensionally. I would say megalomania is a fairly good, accurate word here. Okay, but they still wanted to build it, so they simplified it, dumbed it down, cut away a lot of the larger pieces that weren't going to work, and this is what Antonio da Sangallo actually began to build and was building for several decades. That's his design. So now you have, instead of the Pantheon, you have the Colosseum on top of the crossing. There's a side view, there's a section to it, and why did they stop? There's a large-scale, very expensive wooden model that was made of the project that you can see in the upper portions of St. Peter's today. Shows you how big the model is. It's huge. And there's a digital version of it, just to give you a sense of its exotic, almost oriental character. Why did they stop? Well, they stopped because Michelangelo was around and he interjected his opinion once again and said this is an abomination, and wrote a letter to the new pope saying, really, you guys are out of your minds. This is appalling. This is not Bramante's vision. This is something, first of all, and he criticized the most obvious Achilles' heel. It would have been a cavernous interior with hardly any light, because if you look at the section, these are the windows. The light has to go through there, down there, to filter into the nave. Do you see that? In other words, the light from the nave is coming from those interiors. And Michelangelo just made the point that this is an interior where people will be robbed, mugged, murdered, raped. Okay, the Pope got the point, and he said, okay, and why don't you take over and show us how to do it? And this is where Michelangelo gave us the paradigmatic building, which really is among his handful of permanent achievements, the eventual St. Peter's. He was very pragmatic. He sent to Florence and said, I want careful working measure drawings of the Duomo, because it turns out that the crossing, the dome of the Duomo, is the same dimensions as what they were starting to build in St. Peter's. Much more solid in its foundations, and it was built, it was standing. So he took Brunelleschi's dome as his model, not the dome of the Pantheon. And he had been thinking of Brunelleschi's dome since he was a teenager, because the reason why the Duomo looks unfinished is, again, because of Michelangelo. Because when he was in his late teens, early 20s, they were building the finishing part of the drum, and Michelangelo, in his inimitable way, made it known that what this was basically, he called it a cricket's cage, something like that. They were building something impossibly fussy and not commensurate with Brunelleschi's great lantern and tribunes. So they stopped. And they had a competition. There's the cricket's cage, which is still only partially finished. But the point is, here's Michelangelo's sketch for what to replace it: a huge entablature, and on the corners, paired columns. The paired column motif is what will be carried through. Why paired columns? Because it's an octagon, and so if you end each face of the octagon, you're going to have paired columns on the corners. Here's some of the surviving models from a later competition. So Michelangelo had in his mind this dome, how to fix it, the dome, the great dome of his hometown. There's another version of the cricket's cage. And here is something closer to what Michelangelo was sketching, but the sketches are too indeterminate. Here's one surviving sketch by Michelangelo exploring it. Notice the big round windows. And here's a drawing from the 17th century, just to remind us that he had drawings made, and of course it was buildable. So our dome comes directly out of Michelangelo, taking at his starting point his critique of the dome in Florence 4 or so decades later. Okay, and the lantern. He did get to build a dome and a lantern, of course. This is the Medici Chapel. Here's a close-up of the lantern that Michelangelo built. There you see it in relation to Brunelleschi's lantern, Michelangelo's lantern, and the most successful of all lanterns, Brunelleschi's for the Duomo. So on the way to the final project of the dome is this surviving autograph, which I believe is at the Met now as a part of the exhibition. See the big round windows? See the paired columns? So taking the motif of the round windows and the paired columns and turning it into a hemisphere rather than into a pointed shape. There are two reconstructions based on some of his sketches of this earlier form. Okay. So what Michelangelo did, which was really quite amazing, is he got the Pope to demolish a lot of the construction that Sangallo had started. And his transformation of Sangallo's project is, in fact, making it much more compact. So, in terms of actual fabric, the dark is Michelangelo's modification of the plan, tightening it up and making it coherent in a particular way. So how is this a rebuilding of Bramante's first project? Well, we have to look at the details to see that. So this is what he was demolishing. This is what he was building between the piers, and resulted in the plan as we know it today, at least for the western part of the church. Well, it's all hidden in this very nuanced wall, both on the outside and the inside. Okay, so here's the essential schema, fairly straightforward. Here are two later 16th century engravings of Michelangelo's project with a hemispherical dome. The paired columns are already there. They're in the nave. And a sketch for what we really are, well, open to much speculation, his thoughts for the facade. Here's somebody's hypothesis from the 16th century as to how to finish it. Again, lots of columns. And this is from the Duperroch engraving of, again, a thought of how Michelangelo intended to finish the front. Okay, so let's look at the exterior. Only in a helicopter, a low-flying plane, or from a drone, do you actually see Michelangelo's conception from the St. Peter's today, because it's hidden behind today's facade, and you have to see it from the gardens or the air, or from drawings. So, see the paired columns? You have paired piers, right? And they're paired in a particular way. And the interior as well as the exterior. There's a a sketch of what was probably his final thoughts for the lantern, which is, let's see, very similar to the lantern in Florence at the Medici tomb. And here's a view, a nice early 20th century photograph of the back. So that's what Michelangelo left us with. A central planned church, which still is there at the crossing, looking up. This is still Michelangelo's design. These big circles are Michelangelo's. Of course, finished by Bernini and his extraordinary team. Okay, so where is Michelangelo? Michelangelo is the ground. That is all Michelangelo. And that is the clue to what he was doing. How to make a realizable and yet poetically effective work of architecture that captures what Bramante intended in his diaphanous walls as indicated in plan, but which were never realizable in the third dimension. You do it through high relief sculpture that is architecture. So, you see how the columns are set off against a pier, how the wall is carved away. Those bad conscience columns are these columns here. These are all surviving polychrome columns from Constantine's basilicas, framing these niches. So, I mean, just when you look at the transepts, you are seeing Michelangelo's, okay, and, just a little, the evidence for the original crossing is from this casket that's now in Venice. And I'm going to have to go faster. Okay, so back at the crossing. These huge niches, both on the inside and on the outside, are Michelangelo as well. So, do you see what I mean? He's dematerialized the wall. He's, in fact, even dematerialized the column. The giant order is, in fact, a relief sculpture against a pier, between which he carves into the wall and puts these very dramatic broken pediment windows, which are pushing into the volume of the space, and then below it, you have the columns coming forward from the space and framing these niches. Okay, also the vault is Michelangelo as well. This is the Bramante Peruzzi vault, and this is the Michelangelo vault. And just another photograph showing you the wall. And a drawing of the same, and another close-up. Okay, a section through it. And so briefly, let's look at the exterior. Now, when Michelangelo died, as I said, the drum was started, and two of the exedras were more or less finished on the exterior and interior. And then there was this curious attic, which he began and probably abandoned. There are engravings of the attic. You see, the attic is not the way it is today. There's just a close-up of that engraving. Okay, but more important, the paired columns, the entablature, and each one of these columns is also set up against a pier, and then the wall is carved into. So it is gigantic, low-relief sculpture as architecture that lightens and dematerializes the walls, and also allows us to have a unified plastic whole that isn't just a hodgepodge of little pieces, like that grotesque project that Antonio da Sangallo had settled on. So this is just a suggestion of what his original conception was with the lower walls, and it is probable that the modified attic is also his along the way. There you see an engraving of what it looked like in the late 16th century, another engraving, late 16th century, another engraving, and an elevation of these walls. And of course, the best views are these Piranesi engravings. Very hard to find good photographs. So, okay, there are several morals to this story. How do you make a giant order work at this absurd scale and not make it look crushing and absurd? By turning it into relief sculpture. You see, we read the giant order, but we also read the fact that it is not weighing down on us from about 100 feet up there, even though it may be more than 100 feet up there. See how the entablature is pulled in so that it barely projects in terms of the standard proportions? It's because every vertical plane here and here is actually pulled in. It's leading backwards. So he's able to throw decent shadows without allowing for actual projections. So, what is the moral of this story? He's transforming an architectural paradigm through the sensibility of a great sculptor doing architecture. That's the transformative aspect. We now take it for granted because everybody that followed him uses this as a starting point, but it's not the case. Okay. And for the facade, as a hypothesis, I think this is one of the better hypotheses because unlike a lot of the others, it foregrounds the paired columns only being shown three-dimensionally. So I think the paired motif would have to have been carried through in the facade as well. There's a lovely chalk drawing in the Met collection by Hubert Robert of one of these niches. And the niches will in fact give rise to what now you see in architecture ever since the later 16th century, the triglyph console that the French adored in the 18th century and that we have examples of all around New York if you look for them. And a truly terrible contemporary sculpture of some saint or other that has been added. Just some details. And what was lost, though, of Michelangelo's conception, and I'll close here, is the hemispherical dome. And the fact that Michelangelo was right about the hemispherical dome, albeit it may have been impossible to construct, you can see when you step way back from there you can see the difference between the hemispherical dome and the current pointed dome, is that when you see it from across the city, a hemispherical dome with a larger lantern would have calmly presided over the city, and the current dome is disproportionate to the piers, and also we're missing the scrolls with the statues on top of the paired columns as well. Okay. Oh yes, and finally scale. How did I? Oh, I have to get to the last image. How big is St. Peter's? Well, as you know, it's very big. But people don't actually realize how big it is, even when you're there. Because this is a drawing by John Soane's students of the Church of St. Paul's in London at the same scale as St. Peter's. And you see how St. Paul's, which is not a small church, fits comfortably with lots of space to spare into the section of St. Peter's. It's a stupefying scale that is ultimately redeemed and made inhabitable by human beings by Bernini's brilliant sculptural and architectural pyrotechnics, which would be a whole other lecture. Thank you. Okay. Any questions? No? So, oh yeah, yeah. Listen, listen. Let me just finish. The point being, Michelangelo, in his pride, initiated something which was monstrous, unrealizable, and which crippled the Catholic Church in Europe because of the indulgences. It triggered the Reformation, eventually the horrific 30 Years' War. Okay, so is it his fault? No, but he certainly participated in triggering it. Late in life, in his 70s, he was given the task of making sense of this monstrosity and turning it into something that was worthy of its subject matter. And he managed to do it, but he did it with the imagination and the artistry that comes from his sensibility as a visual artist working in the realm of architecture. And it's so paradigmatic that it's become invisible to us. But it is an act of extraordinary artistic humility as well as pragmatism, and understanding that architecture's complexities are given to us through our eyes to the mind, and if you try to translate it literally into the third dimension through the notation of the plan, you don't create what you think you're creating. So it's in that way that Michelangelo really did realize Bramante's first vision, and that which Peruzzi and the others were trying to realize through these many layered walls, except that if you build it, it turns into something that you didn't intend. But you can represent that layering through the artifice of architecture as an art. Okay, I think that's a better end. Okay, thank you.